Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Di Simone. I am a professional astrologer, and welcome to my presentation on how I have handled my Pluto transits throughout my life. Now that Pluto is going into Aquarius, there is a lot of talk about Pluto, about what it might be doing in your birth chart, where it's transiting, how it will be affecting your world. And I did just finish an in-depth webinar that will be for sale on my website on how to handle your Pluto transits. In this webinar, I talk about Pluto through the houses, Pluto in the sign Aquarius, but I also talk about Pluto through all of the aspects that it can make to the planets in your birth chart, the important planets in your birth chart. And more importantly, in this comprehensive 1 hour webinar, I give you concrete tools and tips on how to effectively handle a Pluto transit. Because let's face it, Pluto's transits can really rock your world, bring you to your knees. They break us down before we build ourselves back up. And they are some of the most difficult times in our life. If they are hard transits, they tend to bring crisis energy our way, but ultimately they teach us about empowerment. And so I hope you go and check out this webinar. The link is below in the description box. It'll take you to my website, insightfulastrology.com. And that webinar will really help you understand how to navigate your Pluto transits with grace under pressure. Okay. Now, this is a bonus lecture. So for those of you who purchased my webinar, you're actually getting this as a bonus lecture at the end of it. But I thought I would make this particular part of the presentation available to everybody on my YouTube channel so that I can show you some real life astrology and so that you can see how an astrologer has experienced her Pluto transits, the good ones, the not so good ones, and how I survived it. Because, listen, I have lived a fair amount of life. I will be 49 years old in May, and I have had quite a few Pluto transits at this point in my life, and the great majority of them have been brutally difficult. But here I am. I have survived it. I have the wisdom to pass on to you. And I hope that watching this video inspires you if you're going through a hard Pluto transit, or if you're going through a more encouraging, mild Pluto transit, so you can see the very best of what it can bring. And so I am going to share my screen and show you my birth chart for this presentation. And what I've decided to do, I literally made a whole time search, a whole list of every single Pluto transit that I experienced in my life since I was 17 years old, since 1990. 1991-ish, okay? I included all of the hard and soft Pluto transits, and I'm also going to talk about what happened every time Pluto ingressed into a new area of my chart. So this is really going to be an educational, informative, real-life astrology video. If you want to know how to handle your Pluto transits, if you want to know how an astrologer handled her Pluto transits, this is the video you want to watch, and the webinar that I have for sale on my website. Link is in the description box below. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. And by the way, thank you all. For those of you who are new to my YouTube channel, welcome. Please consider subscribing to the channel for great astrology content. Hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm share my content with other people interested in high quality astrology videos. And for those of you who are returning to my channel, thank you so much for continuing to support me in my work. And let's talk about my Pluto transits. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you my birth chart first, because before we talk about Pluto transits, for anybody, we have to talk about Pluto in the birth chart. We have to talk about the natal promise itself and what the natal chart symbolizes. What potential is there in Maria's birth chart? That is going to become extremely important, okay? Because without looking at what Pluto does in your own birth chart or what your own birth chart aspects are, you really can't determine how difficult or supportive any Pluto transit will be. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to focus on my Pluto and the aspects and take you on a little bit of a quick tour here. And we'll come back to this as it's relevant with each Pluto transit. So I was born with Pluto in Libra. I am the Pluto in Libra generation. And Pluto's sign placement is not as important as its house placement or the aspects that Pluto makes in your birth chart, because Pluto is in a sign for many, many, many years. And many people share the same Pluto sign placement. What sets it apart and makes it personal in your birth chart is the house placement that it's in and the aspects that Pluto makes in your particular birth chart. So in my birth chart, Pluto happens to be quite dynamic. It is making an opposition with the planet Venus in Aries over here. And that opposition is actually almost exact mathematically. It's really, really close. Pluto is also making a square to Pluto. I'm sorry, Pluto is also making a square to Saturn in my birth chart. Saturn's in Cancer over there at just under 2 degrees. And Pluto is also making a square to Mars in my birth chart. This is actually a T-square. So Mars and Saturn are making a wide conjunction. I do consider these two planets conjunct because Mars is angular and Mars is my chart ruler, so it really pulls that Saturn in. And this is a powerful T-square in my chart. It makes Pluto extra dynamic and potentially difficult when I experience those Pluto transits, particularly, as you will see, when Pluto in the sky triggered this T-square and all of these planets by transit. So that's a little bit about my birth chart. Now let's get to talking about, I'm basically going to take you on a journey of my life up until this point in my life. And I'm going to share a lot of personal stories with you, a lot of personal information, but I'm doing it to bring the astrology to life and to have you guys see what Pluto transits can really mean in your life. So we're going to start with the transit of Pluto in the sky. It was in Scorpio back in 1990 through 1991. What Pluto did at that time period was made an opposition to my sun sign. So what I want to do is show you where Pluto was transiting at the time. Pluto would have been in my 7th house of partnership, other people. Okay, so that's transiting Pluto. It was in the sign Scorpio, and Pluto was making an opposition to my sun and to my Mercury. Now, the sun in my birth chart is in the 1st house of self, but the sun rules the 5th house of children, sex, lovers, romance. Mercury is in the 1st house in my birth chart, but Mercury happens to rule the 3rd house of communication, neighborhood, and the 6th house of work and health. So, oppositions, when you're having, and I talk about this in the webinar, I talk about this, oppositions. I go into this whole discussion about the rubber band effect in the webinar. But when you're experiencing oppositions by transit, it typically involves another person and you work out the energy with another person. So I was 16, 17 years old during these years that Pluto was opposing my sun and Mercury, and even 18. I was 16, 17, 18 years old at the time. Okay, so it was, since it's 2 planets, it was that 3-year period. And what happened was I got a job working at a Carvel ice cream store. And I was about 16 years old. Well, actually, I got the job right before my 16th birthday. So I was still technically 15. This transit was gearing up, but I was 16, 17, 18. I was still working there the whole time. And this job was like a do or die kind of a job for me because I really needed money. I needed to save money for college. I grew up in a typical working class family, Italian household in Queens. My father always worked. My mother was a stay-at-home mom, and my father was the breadwinner. But he came to this country when he was about 17, so he had to drop out of school because his father died, and he had to drop out of school and work and help take care of his siblings. There were six of them altogether. So he really never got an education here in America, and he did physical labor. He worked as a machinist, primarily building airplane parts. So he was very smart, but it was physical blue collar work all of his life. So he made an honest living, but it was just enough money to basically take care of us, feed us, all of that for a family of five. So I had to work, I had to save my money, and I had to take care of my own car insurance, and save up money and pay for college and my books and all of that. So that's why I got this job. And at this job is where I met my first love. And this was an instant obsession for me. I was enthralled by this young man. I was young, 16, 17 years old. So this was, the first love energy, but it was certainly puppy love. It was not real reciprocated, actual love. It was definitely not that. But of course, I didn't realize that at the time. And so here's Pluto in my seventh house of partnership, hitting my sun. Sun is men in our life. And the sun rules my fifth house, and the fifth house is romance, sex, pleasure, dating. And in fact, this Pluto opposition, this is where I lost my virginity. This is where I was in this very passionate, secret relationship with the young man I worked with. He was, I guess, the manager at the time, and I was just a worker. Eventually, I became a manager too, but not when he was working there. So he was, I worked with him, but he was, technically in charge, I guess. So this happened at work. Pluto also is opposing my Mercury back and forth, but the work stuff is going to be a separate situation. I'm talking now about the love situation first. First love, I was obsessed, typical Pluto Sun energy, and literally had sex for the first time. There it was. I was 17 years old when that happened. And I was a secret. It was a secret relationship. Nobody knew. And we never were an official couple. And then I had found out that I was just basically being used for sex. I was young and stupid. A lot of women go through this. A lot of young women go through it. And that's what ended up happening. And that was the transit. And so my cousin said she was trying to help me forget about this guy at the time. And she was like, let me set you up on a blind date with somebody that I think you'd be great with. And she set me up on a blind date when I was 17 years old. And this was just a few months after I lost my virginity with the person I was working with, and was so obsessed over him. She set me up with somebody who I later married. And this is also a reflection of the Pluto opposite Sun transit. Pluto came into my life, and I dealt with it through Sun, through men, through sexual experiences, and it formed a lot of my identity at the time. And it was about power. Okay, Pluto transits are primarily about power and control and manipulation when it is a hard aspect, like a square or an opposition. And so I had somebody manipulating me, and I didn't, I was just in love and in lust and all of that. And so I didn't see it at the time. And so this was very clearly my Pluto Sun transit. But towards the end of that transit, I did, in fact, meet what would become my husband at the time. So then Pluto moves on to make an opposition to Mercury. And this is all the same period. So now I'm more 18 years old. And it was actually, I think it was actually the summer that I graduated high school. So I was 18 years old. And I was right before I was going to college. And remember, I said I needed this job to make money to pay for college. Well, at that point, I was dating who would become my husband, the man who would become my husband. He was still here in the seventh house, right, of marriage partnership. It's no longer exactly opposite my sun, but now it's opposite my Mercury. So I was really determined to get an education, Mercury, uh, to learn, to pay for school, to really do this. I was paying for my car, third house, transportation. I got my first car. I was trying to become empowered in that way. And yet, when you're having a difficult Pluto transit, you're often going to experience a crisis and some kind of difficulty if it's a hard transit. So with the Pluto Sun, it was the crisis of becoming obsessed with somebody who really didn't love me. And I went through that experience, the first love, the heartbreak, the betrayal energy of, oh, okay, he kind of just used me for sex. And I didn't realize it because I was young and dumb. That was that. That was the Pluto Sun crisis. Pluto Mercury crisis. Now I feel so much pressure to make money to pay for school, and I'm working constantly. Okay. Mercury rules my sixth house. I am telling you, I would work double shifts, which was from 10 in the morning until midnight. As many as I could get. I had, I think, maybe one day off, and I was really packing it in that summer. Now, because I was working in Queens late at night in an area where right above us was a train tracks right above us. So it was an area when it would get late at night, there could be some riffraff. So my boyfriend at the time said, I want you to be safe when you're walking to your car at night, especially if you're alone and nobody's with you. So he gave me pepper spray to put on my keychain because by then I was the manager of the store. So I had the keys to the store and I was opening, closing. And he said, if God forbid anything happens, just spray them with pepper spray and run. And that made him feel safer for me. So I had the pepper spray and I was just working, living my life. Two really fascinating things happened to me during this time period when Pluto was opposite Mercury. And that transit didn't really end until 1993. So I'm going to tell you two different stories. One is here's the crisis, and this was actually very dangerous. I was working one night, and I remember so clearly I was working with a young man named Henry, and he was in the front of the store, and I was in the back of the store washing dishes at the big triple commercial sink, getting ready to close up. And at that time, I was tired. I was really working a lot. And so three young men walk into the store exactly when we were getting ready to close. Now, I was in no mood to serve customers. I just wanted to finish cleaning the back of the store and just close up. So I left Henry up there to serve the customers. And here's what happened. I was at the sink. I actually had my first extremely profound and obvious psychic experience, and it had to do with the mind. And this was Pluto opposite Mercury. And it really is a fascinating story, and it really happened. And it's wow. So let me share it. So I'm washing dishes, and Henry's giving me dirty looks because there's three kids up front, and I'm not going to help him. And I just turn back to the sink, and the water's flowing, and then instantly, this voice in my head. It was like a voice going into my right ear, and it was my voice, but it was not my thoughts. This voice screamed at me, Maria, go to the back and open the door, the back door. They're going to rob you. Do not go up front. The minute you go up front, they're going to pull out guns. You're going to be robbed. The voice was instructing me and said, go to the back of the store, open up the back door, pretend that you're on the phone until they leave. And I was like, what on earth is going on? Am I losing my mind? Clearly, I need a day off. Clearly, I need sleep. I really thought I was losing my mind. Why would I start thinking that? I thought it was just me, my mind running away. But no, it was actually some kind of powerful voice warning me. So maybe it was my guides, maybe it was God, who knows? Maybe it was a spirit, I don't know. All I know is that this particular voice, it was my voice, but it was not my thoughts. And it was very intense. And that has happened to me at several points since in my life, always at a life or death moment. always at a very extreme moment. And so I ignored the voice and I said, oh, I must be crazy. I'm losing my shit. I really need to get out of here and go to sleep. So I go up front to help Henry serve the customers. The second I walked up front, one of the guys goes to the front of the store and guards the front door. Another one goes around and pulls out a gun to Henry, and another one jumps over the counter and pulls out a gun to me. So we had guns on both of us, and I immediately peed my pants. I was 18 years old. I was terrified, could not believe this was happening, and I could not believe that the voice in my head actually told me this was going to happen, and I didn't listen. So I had this extraordinary psychic experience. It was a very dangerous moment in my life. They pulled guns on us. Then they locked us in the walk-in refrigerator. So they grabbed us, locked us in the refrigerator, and then they pulled me out because they were watching us and they knew that I was the manager and I had the keys. Didn't know that I was being watched. Pluto opposite Mercury, really Pluto. So they wanted my keys and they wanted me to open the safe. So I was opening the safe and they saw that the mace was on my keychain, the mace that my boyfriend gave me. So what happened was I'm alone with these two men, and one of them puts a gun to my head and the other one puts a gun to my hand so that I wouldn't spray them with the mace while I was opening the safe and getting the money for them. So I had this experience. Then they locked me back in the refrigerator, and I remember that a couple of other things happened during that time. I immediately jumped out of my body when they first pulled the guns out, and it was like an out of body experience where I was watching everything from below. So it was a very protective thing where I had this out of body experience. It was only for a few seconds, but I clearly remember watching everything from below. And so I went back into my body, and then they locked us into the refrigerator, and then he took me out. But I remember when this boy, I'm going to call him a boy because he couldn't have been more than 18, 19 years old. When he took me out of the walk-in refrigerator to open the safe, I had another download in my mind. Voice went in my ear and it said, he doesn't want to hurt you. It is his first time robbing anybody. He's with his cousins. Those are two of his cousins, and he's being pressured to do this. He will not hurt you. He doesn't want to hurt you. It's going to be okay. And it was a very clear message, very detailed. Again, exactly what I just told you. So this is Pluto opposite Mercury. And this very much happened to me. It was a life or death situation, could have been dangerous. I had a psychic moment that was really profound. It was a warning. It had to do with the mind communication, right? Okay, so that's just Pluto opposite Sun and Mercury, okay? I could tell already this is going to be a bit of a long webinar, so forgive me, but hey, I've lived some life, so I want to share all the Pluto transits with you so that you could see how someone survives Pluto. So here's what happened. They never caught the people who robbed us, but I had to heal from that and move on from that. And I actually kept the job because I was so worried about money and paying for school. I was about to start school. I think it was like a week later, I was starting school, something like that. So I kept the job, but it was definitely a big psychic awakening for me where I had my first major profound message. It was a voice in my head. I thought I was losing my mind, but it was real. It was a warning. And so again, Pluto transits. Pluto is going to bring you to your knees. You're going to have some kind of crisis, some kind of loss, some kind of suffering, trauma, betrayal, some situation, especially when it's in opposition, you will attract a Plutonian energy to you. And in both cases, I did. With the Pluto Sun, it was the first guy that I fell in love with. With the Pluto opposite Mercury, it was these kids who probably lived around the neighborhood somewhere, and they jumped on the train and they got away, and they were Pluto. So the opposition, that's what happened there. Now, let's move on. So life progressed, and now it is 1995. And in 1995, my husband, he's now my ex-husband, he proposed to me. I was 21 years old, and transiting Pluto was at this point straddling the end of my seventh house cusp going into my eighth house. But it was like right there, but it was like in both when he proposed to me. So it was straddling end of my seventh going into my eighth. So when transiting Pluto leaves one area of your chart and goes into the next, you're going to hear the noise. A big event is likely to happen when transiting Pluto changes houses. And so, these little transits of Pluto and, the outer planet transits, tracking them across my life and across clients' lives, when you're using an accurate birth time, it really is the main reason why I use Placidus house system, because I have found it to be very accurate for these nuanced transits of house cusps and events that can happen. So Pluto was ending my seventh, going into my eighth, and my ex-husband proposed to me. And here's what I went into right after that. Immediately after that, Pluto ingressed into Sagittarius. So it left Scorpio and went into Sagittarius, and I'm now engaged. And what Pluto would have done is make a trine to my natal Venus placement. And I was born with Pluto opposite Venus in my birth chart. But now that opposition was being woken up and stimulated by transiting Pluto, making a trine to my natal Venus. That's a really good transit, right? It's really amazing. I was born with the opposition, but now that opposition was getting some support, some help. And here's what ended up happening. Venus is the ruler of love and marriage. And in my birth chart, Venus actually rules my second house of possessions and money and livelihood, but it also rules my seventh house of marriage and partnership. And Pluto had ingressed into my eighth house, which is husband's money, shared resources, when I got married. And during the years of my engagement, and when I got engaged, and when I got married, and when I went on my honeymoon, and when I bought my house with him, and we did all these extraordinary things, transiting Pluto was trine Venus in my birth chart. That was a glorious time in my life, because I went from rags to riches during that time in my life, comparatively speaking. Okay, so remember I told you I grew up in a working class environment, normal everyday household, Italian household in Queens. My father worked, but we didn't have, enough. I had to work to pay for college and my car and all of that. And who I married, I actually married somebody who came from a very wealthy family. And my ex-husband was starting to build his own success in real estate, buying property. My ex-father-in-law was extremely successful already in real estate. And so my entire life changed with this marriage. And everything beautiful that Pluto could possibly do to Venus happened to me when Pluto was trine my Venus. It was money, it was love, it was intense. It was really amazing energy. And so that all happened for me. And I'm going to share my screen again and show you Pluto to Venus. And so here is, just so you can see real life astrology here, Pluto would have been here, okay, around 3-4 degrees of Sagittarius at this time that I was engaged, and then I got married. And it was making a beautiful trine to my natal Venus placement, Pluto in the eighth house of husband's money, other people's resources. Venus rules my seventh house. This rules my second house. And there you have it. And that happened, and it was glorious. So you see, not every Pluto transit is going to be dark and awful. Some Pluto transits can really be amazing. But I was born with Pluto opposite Venus, and Venus was square Saturn, and Pluto was square Saturn, this T-square here, okay, with Mars too. So that will become a big, difficult transit later on when Pluto gets into Capricorn. But first, let's talk about Pluto in Sagittarius. So what happened next is Pluto moved on to make a conjunction with my moon Neptune conjunction here in the 8th house. And the Pluto conjunction to the moon occurred when I became a mother for the first time. And so this was 1999 to 2000. And this is when I gave birth to my first child, my son. And I became a mother. And this is what I wanted. I wanted to be, at that time, I left graduate school, got married. I was going to be a traditional stay-at-home mother because that's what my ex-husband really wanted. And I thought that's what I wanted too. So, there were Pluto themes happening, but I didn't really see them at the time because I was living that Cinderella life at that time. And I was just really in love and happy. So I didn't see it. Well, I got pregnant and I had a fabulous pregnancy, no complications at all with my pregnancy. And I really wanted a home birth. My ex-husband was like, no, you're crazy. You're going to a hospital. You're not going to give birth at home. But Pluto's active. So I'm trying to take control, take power over my life, my body, and my birth experience. So I was like, you know what? I'll fix your ass. I'm going to labor at home and nobody's going to know. This is what I thought. Now Pluto's in the 8th house. What's the 8th house? Death, surgery, trauma, crisis, other people's money. Okay, this is all the Pluto 8th house transit. And Pluto is transiting my moon, Neptune conjunction. Well, the moon rules my 4th house, which is home, family matters. And the moon is always a significator of childbirth in a woman's chart. And it's also mother. Okay, so what happened was during my moon Pluto conjunction, I went into labor and I wanted to have my labor on my own terms. I didn't want to go to the hospital until the last possible minute because I wanted a natural birth. I didn't want drugs. So I stayed home and I didn't tell anybody I was in labor. And what happened was I labored all day. I remember being on the phone with my sister and telling her, I think I'm in labor. I'm not sure. My mother-in-law even came to visit me and I hid the fact that I was having contractions because I didn't want her to worry and to tell my husband. So I went to go take a shower because, when you're in labor, having water on your belly really helps with the contractions a little bit. So I went into the shower, took a nice long shower, and then I dropped my mucus plug. And when I dropped my mucus plug, I knew it was time to go to the hospital. I was like, all right, I guess I got to call him. I guess I got to go. So I called, went to the hospital, and remember, this is Plutonian. Now it's a conjunction. I was trying to take control of my birth experience. I wanted the power, but it ended up not going my way at all because I got to the hospital and the doctor examined me and he said, well, you're 9 centimeters dilated. I'm sorry, we can't give you any drugs. And I was happy. That's what I wanted. I got what I wanted. I said, yep, that's what I wanted. I'm good. Don't worry. I wanted a natural labor. So I started pushing. When I started pushing, within a few minutes, everything changed. It went from life to death. I was losing oxygen. The baby was losing oxygen. It became an emergency C-section because it was a prolapsed cord. The cord was wrapped around his neck. Every time I would push, the cord would get tighter and tighter, and he started to crown. So the baby was crowning, and then all of a sudden, he lost oxygen. And so my son almost died, and I almost died. And this was the Pluto Moon 8th house transit really coming to life. And so my obstetrician saved my son's life and myself by performing an emergency C-section, but he had to knock me out. And obviously I went from thinking I had all the control to having no control whatsoever. Pluto. And my son survived, thank God, and all was well there. But after that experience, I then went into deep postpartum depression. Now, I have never suffered clinical depression. I've never had depression since then. I never experienced depression like this before or since in my life. It was such a dark time for me, and it lasted a good 8 months. Pluto moon in the eighth house, deep postpartum depression. It was so dark. And the darkest part was, again, I was trying to get control, to maintain control. And I really wanted to breastfeed my kids. So I wanted to nurse my son. And I didn't want my doctor to know that I was depressed because I didn't want him to suggest taking medication because then I knew I would have to stop breastfeeding. So again, Pluto, control, trying to do it my way. I said, nope. I kept it to myself and it ended up really affecting me deeply. But eventually I got out of it and I was deeply transformed as a mother. And that was the Pluto moon transit. So after that, life progresses. I had my daughter, everything was, great there. That was more the end. It was 2001. So Pluto was still on my moon, but it was the end of it, but it was still active. And then the next major transit that I had with Pluto would have been Pluto conjunct my North Node of Destiny. Now, here is where my calling in life called me. And so, okay, I feel like I'm doing like a tell-all of my life, but I have to explain these Pluto transits. So my North Node is in Sagittarius in my eighth house. Now, I wanted to always be a writer and a psychologist. And I was now a stay-at-home mom, and I had 2 babies. And I was deeply unfulfilled because I'm an ambitious person and I had other aspirations. So I decided to write a book. And it was a family saga. It was called Tears Like Bottled Rain. And while Pluto was starting to make the conjunction to my North Node, but it was still on my moon, it was like moving, it was in between, it was at the midpoint, basically. I wrote the book, I was trying to get it published. And that book tied into my Saturn return, which led me to astrology and my calling in life. And that book never got published. It ended up being a real life prophecy that documented events that actually ended up happening in my life several years later that I couldn't have predicted at the time. But that book ended up being a real life prophecy. And it was a really crazy thing. It was, similar in terms of craziness to what I experienced when I got robbed and I had the voice in my head. And then, that all happened. Well, this book that I wrote really was another spiritual psychic experience, but it happened to help call me into my destiny, into my calling in life. So I'm looking at the ephemeris just because I want to see when I wrote that book, yeah, Pluto was conjunct the nodes when I wrote the book. And it was straddling the nodes from 2002 to 2003. And that time period, when Pluto was conjunct the nodes, I tried to get the book published. And I went to a bookstore because I was trying to query agents and get books on publishing. But what happened was I saw that there was a poster on the wall. An astrologer was doing a mini lecture that night, and he was giving people birthday readings if it was their birthday month. And it was my birthday month. It was May. And so I said, okay, I want this guy to tell me if I'm going to be the next New York Times bestseller. Now, I was interested in astrology at that time, but I had never seen my birth chart before, and I had done nothing beyond sun sign columns. And this was 2002 into 2003. Okay. So I went to the bookstore, and this man, I raised my hand for my reading, and he clicked my birth information into his computer. And the first thing that he did was he looked at me and he said, "Oh, so you're a writer." I died. It was my initiation into real astrology. He proceeded to tell me all of this information. So the astrologer's name, his name is Alex Mallon. He's also an astronomer, and I've since come to know him. He's become a colleague. And he is the first person who showed me my birth chart. He saw how astounded I was, and he invited me up to the podium to see my birth chart and to understand that this is where he was getting his information from. And at that moment, Pluto, transiting Pluto's conjunct my north node of destiny, pushing me towards my destiny in Sagittarius in the 8th house, initiating me into the mystical occult arts. And I knew that I had to learn everything I possibly could about this language at that moment. All the hairs in the back of my neck were standing up. It was crazy. It was a big life transition for me. So during the rest of that Pluto North Node transit, I was looking for my first astrology teacher. I wasn't sure. I was reading books like crazy, but I knew I needed formal learning. I was thinking, should I go with the American Federation of Astrologers at the time? It was, it was early 2000s. I wasn't really so sure about that. I didn't know where to go to formally learn astrology, and I kept asking for signs. Well, at that time, the psychic medium John Edward was a really big deal, and he had a TV show, and he was very popular. And my webmaster Pam had this message board on the computer that I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was basically about connecting with your loved ones and psychic spiritual experiences. And I found that message board, and I was really interested in the show. This is transiting Pluto, North Node, 8th house of death. Now, I was never interested in talking to dead people, but I was very interested in everything occult and metaphysical. So I saw that he was having a workshop on Long Island, an all-day workshop on how to develop your psychic abilities. And I said to myself, I really don't want to talk to dead people, but I feel compelled to go to this. I feel like I need to go to this. And I remember I was so compelled to go to this that I was supposed to be in the Bahamas that weekend for a wedding with my husband. His cousin was getting married, and me and the kids were all supposed to go. And I said, listen, why don't you go and be a bachelor that weekend and leave me home with the kids, and I'll get a sitter and I'll go to this workshop. I really want to go. So he was like, all right, you want to go? Go. So that's what happened. I was compelled, obsessively compelled to go to this workshop. Pluto was operating here. Little did I know that when I got to that workshop, the first thing that the psychic John Edward did was announce that he had a surprise guest speaker. And the surprise guest speaker was his one and only teacher, a woman named Sandy Anastasi. And she was there because she was going to do a little lecture on astrology. And she also has an astrology school, and she was teaching astrology. Again, Pluto, North Node of Destiny, Sagittarius, 8th house. I was like, boom. Okay, the universe put me right in front of my teacher. This was fated and meant to be. Fated things happen during Pluto transits, guys. It really does. So all I could do was look at this woman. I did not care about anything that John Edward was saying. It was really funny because he's in front on the stage, and I was just constantly like looking back at Sandy because she had a table set up in the back. I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to talk to her. I can't wait to talk to her. And so I did. Eventually, I introduced myself and I told her the experience, and I said, you're my teacher. You have to be my teacher. So this is how I found my first astrology teacher. And she did teach me astrology, and I achieved certification through the correspondence school. And then I went on to study with Noel Till, all during my Pluto North Node transit. Okay, now Pluto has moved on again in my chart. And Pluto is going to move on into my 9th house, and it's straddling my 8th and 9th house. And now we're into the years 2004 to 2005. 9th house does rule international matters and legal matters, and also spiritual. And what happens is when Pluto first ingresses into my 9th house, I turn 30, and my husband says, what do you want for your birthday? A party? Or do you want to travel? I said, I want to travel. So remember, he had money. We did a lot of international traveling when I was married. For my 30th birthday, we went on this luxury, high-end, 3-week Mediterranean cruise that just was beyond. And that occurred as Pluto ingressed into my 9th house, between my 8th and my 9th house. So my husband's money was powerfully being used to help me travel around the world, basically, in the beginning of that Pluto transit, when everything was still really good for me. Pluto was good at that time. No difficult Pluto links were happening just yet. So that's when I found Noel Till, and I decided I wanted to try to be a professional astrologer. After I got my certification from Sandy, put up a website during those years. I went to study with Noel Till. So this was all Pluto going into my 9th house. higher education, certification. And then we get to Pluto. I have a nice run. Pluto's trine my ascendant. Everything was great in my ninth house. I was really learning and mastering astrology. And I did start to call myself a professional astrologer. I didn't need the money during those years, but I started studying astrology, I think officially in 2003, studied with Sandy, got my certification by 2005, started my website over the summer of 2005. And I didn't need the money, but I was doing it. I was doing it for free. I was doing an apprenticeship, a 1-year apprenticeship where I just would read people's charts for free and in exchange for feedback. I remember I used to do cassette recordings of consultations and mail it to them and just ask for their feedback. Those years, that's what I was doing while Pluto was trine my ascendant in my ninth house. Now I'm going to show you my chart again, and I'm going to take you to the darkest years of my life. The darkest years of my life lasted from the end of 2000, the middle of 2007 until 2015, actually. It was a long stretch of darkness that I experienced, and that's because my natal T-square was triggered by transiting Pluto. So let's show you the screen again. And here's what happened. And I'm going to try to encapsulate this. This is many years of my life, lots of darkness, but I know this is getting really long. So Pluto is now transiting my ninth house. And it's in Capricorn. Okay, so it's in Capricorn now, left Sagittarius, and it's in Capricorn. And immediately it starts to engage in a square with Venus. But first, the exact hit is the opposition to Saturn. Now, in my webinar, I talk about Pluto-Saturn transits because one of my astrology teachers, Noel Till, taught me that Pluto-Saturn transits are actually the most destructive Pluto transits you can experience. They can be really, really dark. It's like rotting flesh. The structures in your life, Saturn, all break down when Pluto is square or opposite your Saturn. And so, sure enough, my ex-husband left in 2007. He officially filed for divorce in, I want to say it was the very beginning of 2008. Okay. And then it became a really dark battle. It was really, really bad. And there are some things that I'm not going to talk about because I do want to protect my children and my family. But it was evil. It was dark. It was the worst of Pluto that you could possibly imagine. It was really, really bad. And it was one event after the next. So it was not just one crisis moment. It was non-stop crisis. And this is why I'm telling you that you can survive your Pluto transits. We're meant to. The Pluto transits are what give us our strength and give us our power and teach us about personal power. So I went through so many years of darkness where people would tell me, Maria, I don't know how you're still alive. I don't know how you're still standing. It was really bad, but I got through it, okay? And you can get through your difficult Pluto transits too. So Pluto opposite Saturn, the structures of my life really started to break down. But this is also when a horrible legal battle began for me. So at first, it was in family court, and then it became divorce court. And it was really dark. Criminal things were going on. And I don't want to talk about it, but it was really dark. And this ended up being a many, many years long legal battle for me that ultimately led to a trial. And at the trial, that's when I was allowed to have a fair divorce, because before that I wasn't having a fair divorce. I signed papers that I shouldn't have signed, and I was defrauded. And then there was a secret witness that came forth. Lots of Pluto stuff, I'm telling you guys. A secret witness came forth and told me information about my ex-husband that I had no idea about. And she said she wanted to help me, and she ended up testifying at a trial for me. My divorce and this period of my life cost me over $150,000 at the time, and it was many, many years to get through. There were private investigators hired. It was hard. It was very dark. It was really, really dark for me. And it started with Pluto opposite Saturn. And then Pluto started to square my Venus. And remember, I was born with this T square. So it also was transiting Pluto square Pluto, the generational square that we all get. So in my case, this all happened back to back from 2008, 2009, 2010, and into 2011 and 12 was all the Pluto Saturn, Pluto Venus, Pluto squares and oppositions that happened. Okay, that all happened during those years. And those were the darkest Pluto years of my life in terms of marriage, Venus, money, breaking down structures, secret things, legal battles, really difficult stuff going on. Okay, but unfortunately, it did not end after my divorce was finalized because there was one more planet that Pluto was going to make a difficult link to. So Pluto is still here, but Pluto then is starting to make an opposition to my Mars. Now, by then I'm divorced. My divorce was finalized in 2011, even though he left in 2007 and the official divorce, I feel like I was served the end of 2007, early 2008, but I can't remember. So I was divorced in 2011, and Pluto is now gearing up to oppose my Mars when we get to 2012. Okay, so what happens in 2012? Well, look at my Mars placement. Mars is my chart ruler, by the way. So this was really, really difficult. I did go through some physical breakdowns in my body, and my illnesses were all diagnosed during those years. The autoimmune conditions that I have, Hashimoto's, pernicious anemia, lots of things went on in my physical body during that time period. But Pluto was getting close to an opposition with Mars, and Mars is conjunct my fourth house cusp, which is home family, and Pluto is getting ready to conjunct my 10th house. Now, career-wise, my career was really on the rise. I was doing very well, making a name for myself as a professional astrologer during all of those years, during that horrible legal battle, the whole legal battle, everything, the divorce. I was building my career because it's my calling in life, and I was meant to do it. So, when you're meant to do something, it's going to happen. But Pluto was opposite my Mars, and Mars is conjunct my fourth house cusp, and Mars is in Cancer. And what happened at the beginning of this transit, when Pluto was first there, it wasn't exact, it was very close, it was within a degree and a half or so, is we had Hurricane Sandy. So where I lived at the time in Queens, New York, Hurricane Sandy in the area of Howard Beach, Queens, was completely destroyed, completely devastated. And the storm surge happened, and this was a complete destruction of my home. This was in October of 2012. It was like all of a sudden an ocean came down the avenue of where I lived, gushing, and the water rose so fast. It happened within minutes. It was the scariest thing. I was home with my daughter. My son was actually living with my ex-husband at the time because my son was going back and forth. My daughter was with me, and we had tenants downstairs, this old couple and their dog. And all of a sudden, I saw the water, and I was like, oh my God, Fred, indeed, they're going to drown. I have to get them out of there. I go and I get them and their dog, and I bring them upstairs because I was on elevated. They were on the first floor. I was elevated. And as I bring them upstairs, the water rose so fast. The first floor of my whole house was covered. And the first floor of my house, it was divided. So it was their little apartment, and it was my home office. There was a bathroom, there was the garage, there was the washroom. There were rooms in the first floor, but most of the living area was the second floor. But the boiler room obviously was the first floor. Well, the cars were covered, flooded, or the whole first floor was covered, whole first floor of the home destroyed, of me and everybody else. But it was really difficult because at that point, I became homeless. And this was Pluto opposite my Mars. And Mars is in Cancer, and my Mars in Cancer is conjunct my fourth house cusp. And that became a difficult battle because I was actually living in a house that my ex-husband owned. And in the divorce, it was determined that I was allowed to live there till my daughter was 18. And then I had to leave, but now I'm homeless. And it's 2012, end of 2012. And Pluto Mars started with that. And then Pluto Mars for the rest of that transit through 2014 ended up being some difficulty. I ended up moving back into the home a few months later. Repairs happened. But then Mars is male energy. I ended up experiencing that transit with some real difficulty with my son. That again, I'm not going to talk about. It's all over. And, he was young at the time, but he went through a really hard time. I went through a hard time with him. Pluto opposite Mars, difficult. My ex husband was completely uncooperative, and we were fighting a lot about the situations at that time. And that was a dark time. All of those years, really bad. Now, guys, I want to take a moment to just remind you, if you're still watching this, I just told you that I went through years and years and years of nothing but brutal Pluto transits. Brutal. I don't even know how I survived it sometimes. But in my webinar, How to Handle Your Pluto Transits, I really talked to you about those tips on what I did to survive my Pluto transits, how I counsel my clients to handle their Pluto transits. And it's so true that Pluto ultimately is teaching you about your personal power and empowerment, but Pluto also demands that you let go, and certain things have to die in your life at specific points. And that's just reality for all of us. So for me, I had a karmic contract of extensive letting go and death in my life symbolically. And ultimately, from that, I was reborn and I became a much more empowered person and an empowered healer. And that's the highest vibration of Pluto you can get. So I'm telling you guys, you can handle your Pluto transits, even when they're really dark and you have no idea how you're going to do it. Okay. So let's talk about the next phase. And again, I'm going to try to make this quick. I'm going to share my screen one more time and talk to you about great Pluto transits that happens again. Pluto then started to make a conjunction to my midheaven. And as Pluto was conjunct my midheaven, I experienced years of Pluto trine my sun in my 10th house, and then trine my Mercury. So I had a run. I went from all the squares and the oppositions to Pluto conjunct my midheaven, trine my sun, trine my Mercury from 2013, 14 until 2020. All those years, that was my rise more. That was empowerment. That was healing. I, did so many things in my career, podcasts, videos, forget it. So many things that were Pluto Mercury, that were Pluto Sun, career. It was just a really empowering time. And I did rise to a very strong position as a well-respected professional astrologer during those years. So that was really amazing. And then I had my next Pluto transit, which was the most recent one that I have now come out of and healed from, but it was very dark. And it was Pluto square my ascendant. And this began in 2020. So Pluto's now here, 24 degrees-ish of Capricorn. And I bought my own home. I moved, I relocated to Long Island in 2019. So there was a lot of empowerment. I actually signed that contract when Pluto was trine my Mercury. So lots of empowerment, but then Pluto squaring my angles. Pluto square the ascendant, Pluto square the descendant, and Pluto at the same time is going to square Uranus for me because Uranus is conjunct my descendant. And what ended up happening is I met someone as soon as I moved into this house, and that relationship was a very intense relationship. He lived in my neighborhood. It was intense, but he was very Plutonian, and I didn't get a commitment, but it was a lot of sneaky behavior, and I was overlooking it again. It was very similar to my very first love experience when Pluto was opposite my sun, and then ultimately the really dark stuff that happened when Pluto was square my Venus and I got divorced. But now anything that I didn't fully handle and heal from those years, it came back to haunt me. Because that's the thing with Pluto. If you don't fully heal from something, if you don't fully work through trauma, you do get re-stimulated. And at this point, I got re-stimulated with with this person. And from 2020 to 2022, Pluto was square my ascendant. And during that time period, we had a very strong love affair. It lasted about a little under 2 years. He didn't give me a commitment. It was an on and off thing. And ultimately, I found out that he was with me at the same time that he was with my neighbor who lived across the street. And when I found out all of this, it was again the voice inside of my head. I had a whole thing happening where I was told, I was given a message, and it led me to go find them. And I did. It was really creepy. I won't get into the details of that, but that voice inside of my head, I'm telling you, whenever I have a life or death thing, it comes to my rescue. And so I found out. And when I found out, he completely discarded me from his life and went into a full on relationship with the woman across the street from me, who, I don't know, they might be living together now or engaged or whatever, for all I know. But that experience while Pluto was squaring my ascendant led to a big physical breakdown. I was sick for a long time. I couldn't even work for a couple of months. It was a very, very dark period, not as brutal as the extended time that I had Pluto square and opposing lots of planets, but it re-stimulated a lot from those years that I thought was healed, but wasn't fully healed. And so I'm now healed from that and out of that. And right now, Pluto is not doing anything in my chart, but I'm so excited because what's going to be happening in my chart is when I get to 2025 is into 2026 and 2027 is Pluto is going to sextile my Venus and make a trine to itself. And that's going to be some really nice stuff for me. I'm sure it will be. Maybe not as good as when Pluto was trine my Venus, because the sextiles are not as strong as trines, but it's still going to be really good. And I'm looking forward to that. And when Pluto was square my Venus, I forgot to tell you, there was another relationship. So my ex-husband left in 2007, but my divorce wasn't finalized till 2011. But in March of 2008, when Pluto was like 1 degree of Capricorn, it was moving to square my Venus. It was opposed Saturn. So the family life was breaking down and all that. And I was legally separated at the time. Pluto was starting to square Venus. It wasn't fully square. The full square was the height of the divorce. But I actually met someone. And this person I ended up having a 9-year relationship with, very strongly Plutonian again, but in a healing way. He actually really empowered me, helped me believe in myself, value myself, build my business. Really, really positive influence on me. And we were together for 9 years. And then that relationship officially ended in 2017, but he's still in my life, in some way. It's like 15 years now that this person's in my life, and he's a really, really good person. So you can meet someone during a square of Pluto to your Venus, and I talk about this in the webinar, but it's going to be complicated. And the complication was I met someone, I was going through a horrific divorce, and I could never really give this man a full commitment when he wanted one, but we were together for 9 years in a non-traditional way. So that's my Pluto life story. And if you stayed with me for this whole video, thank you for watching. Aside from this ending up being basically an autobiography of my life, as told through Pluto transits, at least, I hope that it helps to bring the astrology to life and helps you see what really happens when Pluto is transiting the birth chart and how important it is to look at the natal birth chart first and see what's going on there before you can really assess how any Pluto transit is going to affect you. Okay, that's so important to do. So thanks again for watching, and I hope you all really handle your Pluto planets with amazing grace under pressure. You've got this.